Hey Rachel, hi.
So cool. Damn it. I wish I had a cool prop. That's awesome. That's the coolest
I
prop. Wow.
know. It's
I,
a dick on a stick. I think you guys have lots of those in your family.
I do actually. Okay, now I'm going to pull out my box.
Yeah, come on. You got stuff to work with.
This is my fun stuff. Oh, wait, where is it? Here. These are my favorite things. Although, oh, wait, I should remember if I'm going to be showing this publicly, but these are really cool. I'm a total.
Oh my God.
These are more
Oh, amazing.
bodybuilding pictures. Yeah, I have.
Yeah.
When the store was closing, my mom was like, okay, well, I'm getting rid, people would come in and buy all these things really cheap. And I'm like, wait a minute, I have
I
to
want that.
of these, torso, anyway, I'm diving in. So good. I love that I need
I
to,
feel like you could flash any one of those on the screen whenever you want during this dialogue.
really big favorite ones are, well, actually, this one's cool, the 90s, but I love the
What's
ones,
that word?
this says unzipped.
Oh, unzipped. It looks like Unzipod, but got it, got it.
My favorite part of making the film was when I was doing the credits and I got to put all of my producers and editor and DP, everyone's name in different items in the store.
Oh, so great.
Yeah,
That sequence was so fun.
cool. I feel like, when you make a well, yours is a complete creative project from beginning to end, but I feel like mine was an attempt at, you know, driving home all these narratives. And I was like, wait, I have to find a way to be creative. And so the title sequence was my one
Uh,
real art creative moment.
yeah, totally. And you felt it, like the joy of it, the joy of that, and the sort of liberation of that was it was so fun. I mean, I feel like you did,
Thanks.
the movie is so creative in so many ways. I feel like the music, the energy of the, music, and, I feel like there's a lot of it that has like incredible freedom to it.
That's so cool to hear you say that because I mean I recognize so much artistry and everything you do, and so but yeah, I do have to say I worked actually with a lot of the indie artists in my scene, and the queer art weirdos who were like, I'll be in your movie, and like when I barely had a budget.
Yeah,
So I was like,
yeah,
yeah, I love your, yeah.
and they provide so much incredible energy to the piece, right? There's just like so much love and energy in those appearances, and like totally awesome.
Well, it's funny. I know we're like diving in so quickly, but it was like part of the actual backdrop of true like dance music that we know of today has its roots in gay porn. It's really amazing. Like,
Really?
yeah, and one of the like even Madonna, she was working with producers who like would moonlight and create the gay porn soundtracks that we hear, like actual electronic music, because it was so cheap to create and it
Yeah,
also was so great, it was like
yeah.
really awesome music. So all of the music that we hear on the radio that's like dance music really does have a gay origin.
Well, that doesn't surprise me that it has a gay origin. What it surprises me that like I didn't know that it has a porn origin. Like that's interesting, right?
And also on the deep like nerd, gay porn soundtrack level,
Oh yeah, and
there
I'm
are.
sure there are lots of nerds who are right there with you on that one.
Well, it's so funny. There actually is a guy who's that gay porn soundtrack nerd, and he helped me. His name, he's amazing, Josh Chian. He runs a record label called Dark Entries, and he literally mines the world for some of the soundtracks to gay porn music. And one of the producers, I actually found music producer who I basically had assumed most of them were dead because he
Yeah.
reissued all these albums and, sad, of course, we know what happened. And there was this guy named Man Parrish who came and gave a speech at an event here in LA. And I remember my music supervisor was like, Rachel, you got to check this out. Man Parrish is giving a talk. So I went to the talk and I walked up to him afterwards and I was like, oh my God, you made the soundtrack to so many great early like 80s porn movies. And would you be willing to contribute maybe something to my film and I'll see what we can do in the budget? And he was like, I would be so honored. And it was
Oh,
this weird, amazing thing. So part of one of the things I'm the most proud of is actually that we do have a true soundtrack element that connects to the original, actual, real.
wow. And so someone like him did have like a relationship to your parents' bookstore, and it like meant
Yeah, and
so
he
much
made,
to him. And oh,
yeah, No, and he was honored because it was like, you know, he felt this legacy of just, he came to the show, he's based in Fort Lauderdale, Florida, and he also does a nightclub in New York. And he was like, you know, he rattled off a million stories about his, you know, that was his favorite moment, of course. And he feels like he, well, as many gay men of that time, of course, are survivors of just a lost generation, the very last ones. Like they're, you know, so he was like, man, I just am so glad to be part of this cultural relic. So, you know, to me, that was like one of my biggest things. I was trying so hard to create the cultural relic, and then I didn't realize it was going to be so much about my family. I wanted it to be more about the store, and you know, it was like this thing of pulling, you know, the history into it as much as possible, because yeah, it became more personal of a film than I expected.
Yeah, it's so interesting that you know, that's where you started, was feeling like it was the place that needed to be
Yeah.
you know, not saved, but at least the like the evidence of it preserved and shown. And that part of your film, I have to say, was just had so much energy and love, and like there was a way in which it wasn't uncomplicated, but it wasn't complicated in the way that like the family stuff is. It had this sort of exuberance and pleasure and affection, and obviously the, you know, all of the feelings that accompanied the AIDS crisis. But you know, it also, all of the loss, right, was in it too. But it just felt like that part of the film, all of the people who were speaking to what that place had meant to them personally, was just this sort of Pandora's box of all of these extraordinary feelings. That, you know, I mean, I think that's why we make films in some ways, is to sort of open these boxes we don't even know exist, you know, and the sort of joyful experience of like, oh wow, there are gay porn music soundtrack nerds. Who knew? Like, that, like, what a great box to open. Pleasure fest.
That is the joy, the ultimate joy, if, right? When you're making a doc, it's like you discover that one person you needed to discover for like your doc. Actually,
Well, and sometimes it's so crazy magical. I mean, like for me, there are many magical moments in this film, but one of the craziest ones is like, okay, like my dad was born without toes. We, you know, do this miracle and restore his toes in the movie, but we had filmed the scene with the woman who was named Lolita, who's my, you know, dad's like old flame. And I asked Lolita's children if they could send me a picture of their dad. They had no idea about my dad's toes. They had no idea about, like, you know, our little mini subplot. They sent me a photo of their dad with his feet up on his desk with no shoes on. And it was just like, how did, like, that's not, you know. And I think that's this incredible, like, weird serendipity that happens where, and of course, like, I feel like with your film, obviously, you know, that like the edge inside your movie is this resistance on the part of your mother to your brother's gayness, and like that, you know, it's like
mm,
the sort of drive to unearth how that could be possible,
right. Well,
right?
you
Like,
know,
how is that possible?
right.
And yet also sort of all of the one love you have for everyone,
Mm,
and the way the film allows you to discover different aspects of who your parents were, you know, that then it's like, okay, you're starting to have a more dimensional portrait of your mother, and yet you also know all of this hurt and difficulty and unspoken, you know, conflict, all of that, right?
no,
But I
and
mean,
yeah,
yeah,
so no, I was just gonna say, like, part of the thing that, of course, when you make a film, like, of course you did it, you know, I would almost say it's sort of a funny thing. I love being able to talk to you just because you and I have like similar but opposite films
yeah,
in some way, where you're like, your dad is like the most awesome subject who's just like along for the craziest ride that you're willing to go on. And whereas my mom's like, get that camera out of here. If I had, you know, editing the amount of shots with my mom telling me this isn't going to interest anybody and I wish you would stop already, and you know, the amount of stuff, but this unwilling participant who sort of allows me to just do it finally, like she relents. But I was going to say, one of the things that I did find so fascinating throughout my process of just interviewing the clerks and the employees over not just this year of shooting or couple years of shooting, but later, after talking to them after the film was out, that my mom was almost like their Jewish mother that they never had, who was like tough on them and made sure that they finished college, or would call them up and find out, did you get signed up for your 401k, because I want you to get that really clear. And then really like help them with all these things and be tough on them. And she's just an unrelenting Jewish mother. And just this idea that like truly it doesn't matter, I don't care what you are. And I will say, my mom also hired trans people before. I mean, I remember the first trans woman I ever met. I think I was like 6 years old. She was a no, not a Vietnam vet, a Korean War vet named
Wow.
Dolly. And I remember when my brothers and I met her, my mom didn't introduce her as a woman with a deep masculine male voice, but my brothers and I were like, wow, Dolly has something interesting about her. But like they were just like normalizing us to this very LGBT world that I grew up just, I mean, of course I absorbed totally into it with unabashed freedom. And, I don't get this into the film because I didn't want to make it about any part of my journey, but I'm queer. I really always have been, but I've been on the art house side of queer, where my friends are like the performance artists ripping off all their clothes and doing like bodily harm in public and crazy shit. And my brother was like just that guy who wanted to be like Pete Buttigieg, like perfect. And then his gay maleness was so tied to this heavy death and just sadness that I don't think I had the ability to wrap my head around as a teenager who was an artist who liked John Waters and drag and everything crazy. And so I just sort of had ignored my brother's journey until really many years later. We're very close, but when I interviewed him for that film, it was the first time I really processed, oh my God, what he was going through, like buying a one-way ticket, imagining he couldn't
Yeah.
come home. And, I just had that recognition where I was so mad at my mom on the one hand, being like, wow, I can't even believe like the level of religious crap that we, it's funny, like I just had a really great conversation at a synagogue with the lesbian rabbis, who there were no lesbian rabbis when I grew up, and I didn't know that was possible. And so we were in a very conservative, old, male dominated synagogue. And I'm like, why were we going to that hardcore conservative place? So I had this feeling of things that I was sorting out through the film that I only realized I was even sorting out as I made the film. And part of it was, yeah, with Josh right there.
Well, I mean, I think that's like, I mean, in some ways, like, people have this sort of reductionist thing of films as therapy. And I think, if we're making a film, we're trying to explore something in a way that can be translated to others. So it's not only us trying to figure something out, but I do, with all of the different directors I've worked with on so many films as a cinematographer, it's pretty much always the case that the director uh, doesn't understand consciously why they're making the film, and that it is only in the making of the film that the need for it is revealed. And so I sort of consider that part of the process. And in this, not like, oh, the directors don't know what they're doing way, but no, like part of this, the miracle of this form and the way we sort of go over things in the edit room, in the filming, in the saying it's not enough. It's like we're searching to understand like what's really, why am I making this? What's at the heart of it? And some of the reasons you think you're making it, you sort of get through them fairly quickly and you realize like, this isn't all there is. So like in your case, obviously you wanted to pay a certain like respect and homage, and create a historical record for what the shop had been for people and what it meant to be gay in the eras that the shop existed in. But on a certain level, sort of once you had done that work, then this other work started surfacing in it. But I'm curious, like why you. I mean, I think your presence in the film, we understand that you feel certain freedoms, but why do you feel like, in some ways, you kept part of your presence and your history out of the film?
Well, it's so interesting. I think, well, first off, I want to throw one little thought out there because I just think one of your amazing qualities as a director now is so tied to what you have as the wealth of experience working with all these directors as a DP. And I don't know if you know one of my DPs, Gretchen Worthen. Does that name ring a bell? She's
Yeah, 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 yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
she was so great to work with because she ended up having this rapport with my mom, and also Cynthia Childs is one of my producers. Also, they're just amazing. And I will say, as we all know, there's it's a village, and the myth of the director being this person
Oh,
does it all. I 100% love to shout out all these people and my editor Catherine, because a lot of it was them telling me, okay, and I would notice Gretchen would be like, Rachel, like if you hang out in that aisle, I'll just ask your mom some questions. And I would be like, oh my God, great. Because I know she's playing to the camera because she loved Gretchen. My mom was like, where's Gretchen? Okay, I'm going to talk to Gretchen about this. And then Gretchen would be like, Karen, in the expo, she was running around following her. And I'd be like, okay, Gretchen, just you do it. Because if I would show up, my mom would be like, you know what, Rachel, this isn't interesting. And she would just initiate her mom tone with me. And then so I just had this thought in my head of just like, wow, the thing that you get when you are a sensitive DP who dives into that connection with the subject and negotiates the relationship with subject, director, shot, you have all of that in this amazing way. And that's why when I have to say, I really responded first to Cameraperson when I saw that movie. And I just love that movie because it was this moment where I was like, oh, I'm witnessing what a deep, what a true DP is doing when they just sit with it all. They're not struggling, it's not about the director doing that thing over. It's like the footage and you let it speak. And so I was so excited to see Dick Johnson Is Dead for that reason, that I had come off Cameraperson where you had taken this footage, almost like assemblage collage artist created this new thing. And then now it was going to be your turn. So it was really exciting. And I know that I tangentially got around this question that you're asking, but it was a really interesting thing as I was making my film to realize that I'm in some ways the last person to see what I'm really doing, and I kept understanding that, and I kept, but it requires the trust of the people. So I kept feeling like, wow, I really could trust Gretchen and Cynthia and Catherine and meet another DP, like all these people. I'm like, I actually could. I just built up the trust longer and longer, and then, and that's part of where things came from.
Totally. Well, one, thank you for seeing me and the
Oh my God,
way
yeah.
that I'm engaged. But I think what you're putting your finger on for me is like sort of philosophically almost. I really think of the camera as this catalytic force, right? Like it creates these possibilities. And I also think of it as this network of relationships. And one of the things that I think is so interesting for all of us as we, grow up, age, and reflect on who our parents are, we we've got so much stuff of our own to process. It's sort of about what our childhood was, and now we've got the adult perspective on us as children and what our parents were doing. But somehow, I think for a very long time, we imagine that our parents are static in the process, or that we have the beat on who they are. And now we've got perspective on it, right? And we get it. But in fact, like you talk about with having your DP there, Gretchen there, like she is seeing your mother with different eyes than you see your mother, and your mother feels herself being seen in a different way.
Yeah.
And right, so there's sort of this dimensionality to who your mother is in relation to you, and who she was when you were a kid, and who she is when you're a 20-year-old, and who she is now, and who she is sort of with the fear of what's this movie going to become, right, all of those things. But Gretchen comes in, and like Gretchen's coming in with curiosity, humor, friendliness, warmth, no critique about her mothering, no pushing back, right? And so I think like I think there's a way in which we all feel misseen or unseen for like the complex humans that we are, right? And so when the camera comes into the space, it's both terrifying and there's a little bit of like a frisson of like, oh, maybe I'm going to be seen. And some of that, I think, it depends who people are and how much they have to hide and what they're afraid of and how like how much of their lives they've spent like presenting in a certain way. Um, but I think what you're saying about, sort of having this group of people engaged in all these different relationships then starts to like crack open parts of your mother that you have never gotten to see. And you only can see it in the edit room, or you can only see it when one of the people who works in the store says, she helped me with my 401k,
Yeah,
right? And suddenly, like, you see your mother in a more dimensional way. Um,
yeah, it is. I mean, I think that's the magic of me. I mean, I have to say I feel really lucky, well, and it's so amazing being able to talk to you about this, because I really do feel lucky to have caught my parents at this moment. And I mean, we both had films come out at this moment in history where like all of it is just like so insane that there's a possibility literally that any one of us, not even just the elderly among us, our parents, could die of this crazy disease suddenly. And one of the things that started me off of my film, and I guess in some ways it's not unlike yours, was I just was talking to various friends. I was living in New York before I made the film, and I wanted to make a film about the store. I had just no interest in making it about my parents. I loved the store. I did art shows there. The store itself was like a person to me. It was such a beloved part of my just life. And then the thought that the store was going to close, I remember I was talking to a friend who basically said, Rachel, you should do this now while your parents are healthy. I
hmm.
remember she said that. I
and,
was
you, and you're like, what's she talking about?
like, but why? I'm more interested in the story, and she was just like, no, you really have to remember that at their age, things happen. And it's a strange thing, because I was going to tell you this. So I had a day job. I don't know why I didn't put two and two together, but I worked in a nursing home. And every day I worked with people with dementia. And I never thought in my head there was any chance of my parents going down that road. And then why would I not think that when I would meet people every day who would see their mom or dad and just literally the look of shock of like, they would have been like me or you or anyone else who's suddenly blindsided by this thing that changed their parent radically. And so I don't know why I didn't think of it, but then I remember she was like, no, you really take it seriously. Like, they are in this particular state right now, and you only have a window of time to do it, and it was that like wake up call that got me to come back to LA and really urgently start shooting. And other people were saying the same thing to me, like, do it now because the store's going to close. Your parents are in good health. And it was just, I had this moment watching your film. Weirdly, I was thinking the same thing. I was like, wow, it's amazing how you caught that moment.
Yeah.
And I mean, it gives me the chills just thinking about it. Like, no one's done that before. And so I know I'm pivoting to that your film.
I think, what's fun. I do think this is like such a insider conversation, right? Like,
Yeah.
because anyone who has attempted to film a personal story knows that it's fraught in all of these like remarkable ways. Like, things feel impossible. Like, it's impossible to have this conversation or impossible to talk about that. But then when you begin it, it sets all these things in motion. And I like, it's like what a gift your friend gave you of saying like, hey, wake up, and I think, in my case, I was like woken up by this dream that I had, where it was like, my dad was in a casket. And obviously I had the wake up call of my mother's death, right? Which woke me up on so many levels as a human. But what we know as filmmakers is, it's really different having people talk about things after the fact or being in the moment.
Right.
And, this sort of moment of the store being pulled apart is, you don't know what's going to happen, but it turns out like almost everything is going to be meaningful. Just like your mom sorting through these boxes of things that like, are in these formats that don't even exist anymore. And she's sort of like, looking at the lost stock, but in fact, it's this lost history. And those kinds of moments, if you set them up, they don't resonate in any of the same ways. And I sort of, that's what I love about doing observational documentary work in the moment, is that there's just all of these reveals about what's important. And I think what you're saying about your mom is so interesting to me, about how she kept saying, this isn't interesting. Don't film this. Why are you filming this? Like that whole sort of set of footage that you have like that. And I really wanted to talk to you about secrets in your family, and like the where the meaning, like what insights you've gleaned about why it was so important to your parents. And obviously, like, I think it is reasonable and appropriate that parents like not show their young children like hardcore pornography, right? Like when they're little kids, right? I think there are reasons why it made sense for them to shield you from some of the things in the store, or what the store was early on. But then sort of silence became the norm or the necessary, I think, for a period of time. And then obviously you broke free. But can you talk to me about that? I'm just really curious about it.
It's so interesting since the film has come out. I mean, there's so many things to talk about in what you said. It's like such a juicy, amazing question. But because there's a world of people that are like me who grew up with parents in the adult business, and I've since become friends with lots of them, and they all have such interesting, varied stories, like truly varied. And one of my new friends is actually, her mother has the greatest story ever. She's very famous in the porn world, Suze Randall. She's like the ultimate iconic photographer of women. And it was interesting to note that like the top Playboy and Penthouse model for the centerfold for photography was was a female photographer in the 70s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. Wow. And she just has a great personality. And I've since met Holly Randall, her daughter, who's also in the industry. And
like that movie?
We'll call, you and me will have a call about that later, because there's a doc there that's so insane, and definitely. But so I'm actually talking to Holly about like, how would you make a film about your mom, who's a legend and who loved her work? So it was the opposite for me. Like my mom would never tell me about her work, whereas she got to be in a place where her mom was like, I will say it's a different world, the straight world. The straight world to me feels like, funny enough, but like another planet. And I'm fascinated by that difference between the gay porn world and the straight porn world, because they're radically different. But I also now have another insider view to it, which is that my partner is Buck Angel, who's a transsexual porn star. And there's a doc about him. I guess I have docs all around me. But wow. Yeah, so I've opened like my own sort of window into these different channels in the adult industry in my life, sort of since the film has come out in some ways. And, I guess it's the last 2 years I've become more deeply connected to people that had just varieties of different growing up experiences. And so what I feel like your question is so great, and it hits on something that to me is the profound piece of it, which is that what was the secret all about? Like why, at a certain point when you're like 15, my mom could have been like, hey, we own this legendary store. It's really cool. It's great. It's in the gay community. Welcome. But as opposed to like, we don't go in there, and of course my friends were going in there. But on the other hand, I do have to say my dad was always much more free thinking and just a kind of carefree guy. So the shame and secrecy was entirely my mom's doing. But my mom is as one of the clerks says, wears the pants in the family. So my mom's force of nature, personality really dominated everything. And I really feel like the key when we think about where the shame factor came from is religion, and I think my mom had a classic, like really hard line ideology that is as in line with one of her best friends is a Catholic woman who had the exact same type of hard line, homophobic thought process, who had to reconcile her kids coming out. She has two gay twins. And my mom and her just totally related, in sync, on the difficulty within the biblical piece of their brain that couldn't resolve it, and like, I'm a good person and how can they be gay? And like, I mean, it's so astonishing to me, exactly as you're saying, like that we're struggling with this piece of it. Well, they ran this gay porn, so they produced gay porn. Like, how could there be a conflict there? But that was what made the film resonate as a film, I think, is that
that's right, because there was like a thing at the core of it where you're like, how can this be?
Yeah.
How can this contradiction be? When of course, like, I mean, that's like, if you get into any human being, like that's where the, the juicy part is like,
Yeah.
obviously there's contradiction in being human. That is the state of being human. But it's interesting what you're saying. Like I definitely, I lay many things at the doorstep of religion. But I don't think that shame is only coming from religion. I do think that, humans hurt each other,
Mm-hmm.
and they hurt each other in the context of sex. There is violence and abuse that is done that is shameful.
Mm.
Right? Like people do get hurt, and I think that there's all kinds of circumstances in which that happens, but they involve one person who has more power over another person, and then there's a cover up
Mm.
of what happened, right? Because it happened in this sort of private territory of the body,
Mm.
right? So I think shame, it's interesting because I often talk about, with film students, I sort of talk about like, you've got to figure out where your shame is located in
Mm.
order to do creative work.
Wow.
Because, creative work reveals you. And if there are things that you don't want revealed, then you're not going there creatively, right? And so it's sort of trying to examine, and I think about it often, I sort of talk about like shame as something that has to be overcome, or, but then, there are shameful behaviors. It is shameful to do harm or violence to another person. That is wrong, right? And
Absolutely.
I think that you know there can be so much murkiness and confusion what happens when two naked humans get together that that lots of that gets covered up
Yeah.
in some kind of way, right? And then pornography is the place where it all gets uncovered and photographed, and there's evidence of it, and you can see the faces of the people doing it. And so there's like this really interesting contradiction that lives in your film, I think, like between the visualization of sexuality
Mm.
and the hiding, of all the things that might happen when two bodies come together, or more than two bodies, right? So I just found that like sort of um, ex- exciting and interesting in your film to think about like the sources of shame and how they function, and and I I think like in some ways, like you hope religion is helping people like exist in a healthy way in the world and create community. Often it's covering up all kinds of things, all kinds of abuses. But it's just interesting thinking about your mother's relationship to like, who is God? What does God see?
Yeah.
uh, or am I seen by God? My whole thing is like the all-seeing God that I grew up with and believed in as a child. And I just think so interesting to be running a business where you're creating images of everything and disseminating images, right? And then somehow there's a sense of like, we can keep this all under wraps. Like it's like the contradiction is like so implicit. It's really funny.
Well, it's so interesting when you think about religion. And I mean, I have to say, one of the things that I do find so fascinating, and the wealth of different ideas you just brought up is like, okay, where to go? But there's, in your spectrum of the religious experience, it's tied to Christianity. And I will say that mine is tied to Judaism, and where the Judaism that I grew up with came out of a kind of, I will say this is sort of like self-preservationist, like recently gotten through the Holocaust, post baby boomer generation of like, okay, we're Jewish, and like there's a Jewish identity that's baked into the just biblical religious stuff, which is also, I think, very, almost like a tribalistic sense of like, look, people don't like Jews. This is going to make it worse for Jews if they find out we're in porn. So just remember that. Don't tell anyone, and especially don't tell anyone who's Jewish ever that we're in this business. So there's this level of, when you're talking about shame, that I came to recognize too, because I will say this, I went to Hebrew school. I went to all these Jewish things, and I hated it. I really hated all of it, because I didn't know why I hated it so much, except that it was conservative. It was culturally conservative. And it was ground into me. I remember going to a Hebrew school class where they brought up the "Thou shalt not lie down with another man," and I just was like, wow, okay, wow, that is so insane. Like, it didn't jive with the I didn't even fully understand how gay my parents' business was, but I was like, it just doesn't jive with the world I live in and me as a person, queerness that I believe in, and humans. And so, I had this personal, like,
How old are you?
battle. What's that?
How old were you when you were figuring that out?
I mean, I was in high school. So when I was in junior high school, I just was like I was always the artsy outcast weirdo in my own family. And my brother Josh was the perfect one. My older brother was the nerd, and so I was just the one who was going to push buttons and be radical. But I didn't know those types of kids until I got to high school, and then I found the goth kids and the weirdos, and they were all gay, and they were my queer family. And so I found, I guess I didn't even, one of my friend Fernando, who eventually became a clerk in the store, said, we didn't even think of ourselves as queer. We were just arty. We were punks. And the music we listened to was in that space of total freedom. And I remember also the gay scene at that time that was kind of more Circus of Booksy than it is now. There was no like corporate, LGBT rainbow flag, stamp of approval on anything. It was like you were kind of out there. And so it totally jived with my sense of being. And when I thought about this sort of moment for Josh, the question of like me, Rachel, my sexuality, or my piece of myself in the story that people have asked me about, well, I never even really came out to my parents. Like, I took a girl to prom and we both wore the same like 1950s dress. Like, everything I did was going to be, I mean, it was, and they even said to me, like, we were shocked. We would have been shocked if you weren't, out there and doing something weird. But I also have to say, I think being female gave me more of a free pass to just also being, they weren't afraid of what might happen to me in the more queer LGBT female space. Josh coming out as a gay man after they had just seen so much of a horror, and my mom had to be there for these guys. I think that's one of the pieces of the film that I just felt like, okay, my queer journey through the arts and it was pretty awesome, and I just still exist in this queer space. It would take away from the central point of that weaves together gay male specific culture, Josh's gay male specific, connection to my mom, when she even said, well, this is an abomination in the Bible. Like, those words wouldn't have necessarily come out of her mouth with me. I think they are so tied to that.
Because sometimes some parts of conservative Judaism like don't care what happens to the female destiny, right?
Exactly. No, it's, I mean, it's also the horrible truth that women are second-class citizens. We don't matter as much, but
I mean, I hear you on how rich the story that you had to tell was, that like, there's a certain point, it's like, can I pack more into this movie?
yeah.
But in hearing you talk about all this, like, I have to say, it is completely fascinating that you felt the freedoms that you did and that your brother didn't, and to have the insight of, I think so many times when our parents like crush us with their response to one of our choices, it's out of their own fear, right? It's coming out of their own fear of what might happen to us, or in some ways it's coming out of their own experience of what happened to them. So, I love the way that, you brought up both the fact that your mother, having seen how devastating the AIDS crisis was to so many people that they cared about, that she couldn't sort of bear the idea that her son might have to go through something like that, right? So that's one piece of it. And then I also love the fact that you brought up the way when you are part of a collective community, like I'm Jewish, that in the period of history that your parents existed in, there was too much at stake, right? Like you couldn't let down the group, right? And we know this is the other thing of like how much stuff ends up going underground because a group of people who have been discriminated against or, sort of violently suppressed, like you don't stick your head up on behalf of the group, but then you don't get to exist. Like your community within that group starts meaning that you have to sort of go underground with your own presence or needs or thoughts. And I think that is in the story throughout. The question of like, your mother wanted to be a journalist, should have been a journalist maybe, and didn't have the place where it was possible for someone who didn't have money, was a woman, to like get a foothold in that industry. And so she's like, we got to feed the kids, like we've got the kids and we're going to feed the kids, right? And sort of how people end up doing work that they feel shame about, like they would have wished something different for themselves.
Well, that's
but it wasn't open to them.
Totally. And this is what's so interesting. Like when I compare, my mom hates when I use this word, but when I compare myself to the other porn kids I know, like Holly Randall, whose mom is so proud of her work and is like a famous photographer who took like these breathtaking pictures of all these, female, we don't hear the story of like the women in the porn industry who actually loved their jobs. And so I remember thinking, man, I'm so jealous. Like your mom was in the industry and loved her work. I mean, I just had this weird feeling of like, that's a weird thing to be jealous of. Like, I'm jealous that your mom wasn't ashamed of it. Like she was like, she passed that on, that like you could be totally cool with working in the sex industry and like not shaming you for anything that like and then I thought, wow, that's so interesting, because maybe not being Jewish is a part of it, and they came from a different place, but it's so interesting because I think that that's one of these powerful pieces of the puzzle that you just hit upon, was that generation. I mean, this is also why I do have to say women's stories of that generation, and Holly Randall's mother is the same age as mine. Like their stories are so desperately needing to be told, because they just got this arc where we just started getting rights. I know I'm completely indebted to all the work they did and the sacrifice, and then they didn't get to necessarily see the kingdom, and here we are being like, hey, you actually mattered. And I kind of have this constant battle with my mom, like, Mom, your work was important. And she's always having to say like, no, it wasn't. And I'm always like, it was, it really was.
But there's the empathy for her experience of it. Is like, it wasn't what she wanted. She didn't get to blossom in the way that she wanted. And when you say your work is important, in some ways it's a form of, she feels not seen in that. Right?
Wow. You just hit on this thing that is so insane. Oh my God, Kirsten, it's insane that you just said that, because my mom used to always, so we would, in the days before COVID, we went to all these festivals, and now I have to say, I just feel so lucky that I had the experience of being at LGBT festivals, like Outfest, Frameline. Oh my God. And going to these festivals, and people there would be a standing ovation every single time I would bring my parents out on stage. And my mom, it was weird. Her reaction to it was always like, feeling frozen, and just what you just said, that she doesn't feel seen in that. And she would say to me, she has a total awareness of the ACT UP movements and, the Harvey Milks and the people in her mind who really did deliberately set out to help. And she feels like she accidentally did all this. And she's like, I just did what was the right thing to do, because, in her mind, I was going to go back to this one thing about like Jewish family values. Her family values that are Jewish in some ways, overrode her religious values when it came to the moment when her beloved employees, who she totally loved, like kids in some ways, when they were dying. And she's like, your fucking mother is not here right now. And she would get so mad, like, I cannot wrap my head around it. It doesn't matter what you are. Your mother should be here for you. You're dying. You're 25. And it would just, even to this day, she tears up and gets so angry. And that is like the righteous anger that I do feel like is at the core of some sort of Jewish value of like, at its essence, if you're going to be properly Jewish in my mind, it's that, like, just be there to be a good human being, and the biblical stuff, okay, let's forget about that for right now. And so that to me was all she was doing in her mind. She goes like, that's all I was doing for the gay community. They didn't have anybody like that. But she can't wrap her head around that it's the same kind of thing that truly I believe that people who are saving families in the Holocaust felt about, well, you just figured we liked Anne Frank, we should throw her family into the, you know, back room because, we would feel bad if we didn't, they didn't set out to be heroes. And so I think my mom would always feel so uncomfortable with the accolades, but at the same
Yeah.
time I think that's where the like, the righteous Gentile movement that came about, that Israel like honors the people that
Right.
saved
He's like the righteous straight person.
the righteous heterosexuals. Yeah. But it's
Mm,
I mean, I do have to say, I think that's what's so amazing about looking back also at LGBT history. And I think it's nice to see also in the telling of the stories that like I've heard it again and again, I'm sure you have too, that so many gay men feel so profoundly, attached to all the lesbians who came out and helped them. And, my partner was one of those lesbians who was there and said, it was us burying all our friends. And I just feel so also like the story of a community being filled with the people that it was, which included straight people, and that's really important to sort of create the portrait of the history.
right. I mean, yeah. I mean, I think that there's just so much history that has yet to be told and understood. And I do think that your film is such a piece of a puzzle, so
No,
important in terms of acknowledging what people went through and also the like sort of the joy and the fun of like what existed before things became commercialized and mainstream. And there's so many aspects of what are recorded in your film that feel like missing history, that that this the courage of you just being like, okay, like it's not easy to like face up to my mom in this situation and how much she doesn't want me to do this, but I'm going to do it. Like, I think, you deserve like incredible kudos for that, because it's not easy, I think, to face, to see, like, I imagine when you see your mom on the stage going rigid, being uncomfortable
yeah.
with this film being in the world and her role in it. And I can imagine that this is a process for both of your parents, but certainly a process for her in relation to you and your brother. And I have huge amounts of respect and empathy for her, because she does come from a different generation and has lived through a different period of history than we have. And I know, my dad like could totally do this movie, but my mom in a million years would never have made Katie Jo Johnson is dead. Never in a million years.
Wow, that is such a good point. That is I do have to say that is such an amazing point, the radical difference between male and female experiences in just the generation before us. And you have to think it's like my mom was forced to wear a dress. Like I can't imagine a world in which I was forced to wear a dress. Like you have to do that. But and I remember when she said something about working her very first job in the newspaper, to your point, it was, I think, at the Wall Street Journal. She was trying to apply it, and it said women need not apply. And she said, I wanted to apply anyway to work in the mailroom. And it was like, wow, women need not apply, being explicitly stated
Yeah.
on a document like that. So, I totally agree. Like when we look at male and female experiences, just one little generation above us, it's so incredible that the changes that have occurred. And I
Yeah.
think being respectful of that.
Absolutely. I mean, I have this wonderful group of 5 women who I have been sort of in conversation with for the last 20 years about our art making. Everyone does different things. One writes, and there's a painter and a couple of filmmakers. And, over these many years, I think we all, through hearing each other talk about each other's mothers and watching each other's trajectories, like it's easier to have empathy for other people's mothers than your own as a woman, I think, because in some ways we had to push so hard against all of their fears for us and their shame about us and what they wished we would be that we weren't, and and all of their criticism and all these things, right, that I think came with the package of women of that era, right?
Yeah.
And another great movie that we're all, in the same circuit with, not at festivals, but in this moment, is Boys State. And guess what? My mom was elected governor of Girls State of Wyoming. Like my mom was amazing.
So
And then, you
cool.
know, she like became a wife, right? Like, and was a mother, right? And I think that the sort of disappointment of that,
Hmm.
even if it was sort of supposed to be getting everything that you were supposed to get, and you had a wonderful husband who was a wonderful person, and you had wonderful kids, and you had a wonderful house, like, mm,
Right.
more was possible. And the my therapist always tells me, like, that daughters live out the unconscious desires of their mothers. So my
Wow.
my yeah, you never heard that? Your therapist never told you that one?
Okay, I'm gonna end up like decompressing from this for like a few weeks. Oh my God, that's an amazing thought. No, I never heard that before, but it makes.
Yeah, well, I love it. I love it. I think it's, I mean, whatever. I have all kinds of my own ties to Judaism in so many ways. One of them is through, the history of therapy that I think is so amazingly interesting. And, um,
Well,
but
there's something about your film. It's weird. I don't can't put my finger. There's something kind of Jewish about your film. I don't know why.
well,
Yeah, it
many
is.
people say the Seventh Adventists are the most Jewish Christians there are. I mean, we do have the Sabbath, you know,
Uh,
yeah, and we don't need scavengers.
there's something that you just said that I thought was so amazing, and it is the remarkable, I think, distinction between our films and our. Because I remember even just the start of it, I was like, wow, I can't wait to talk to Kirsten about doing them. We both did films about our parents, but at the same, but what's so amazing about your film, it feels so different, and it makes me wonder. Your film feels like it's a father-daughter film, and that relationship, your dad is he's just so adoring of you, and there's just like a part of it that feels to me like just this constant love of like there's not that battle, there's not like this, I mean, and I sort of have that with my dad, and as you can see, my dad, I had footage where I was traveling around with him, and he's just sort of along for the ride, and he's happy-go-lucky, and it would have probably not made as interesting a film, but with your dad and what you put him through, and you kept pushing, and he just let all these things happen, and it was so much connected to. I mean, I think it was so joyful, and I mean, so wonderful and joyful, and this way that you like created something that I think speaks to the just the beauty of that relationship, that in a way it feels very pure. I mean, I don't know if that's me projecting, but I just had that, and I think because I have a similarly just easy relationship with my dad, and but I think with my film is much more mom centric.
Yes, yes. Well, I mean, it's funny because my mom is definitely in my film too, and Nels Bangerter, the wonderful editor who cut it, is always like, "You got another film about your mom to make. There's another one in there."
Yeah.
But I mean, every film needs its struggle, and in this case, I think I am. There's much that I am struggling with, but it's not. I got no score to settle with my dad. Like,
Well,
right,
that's
like.
what I mean. Yeah.
I'm
On that level.
there's a peace and an easiness and just like a respect and love of like, oh my God, he's just been like so great my entire life. I refuse to let this end. Like my problem is with dementia. My problem is with death. It's not with my dad. But I think the the complexity in your film, um, it it reflects all of it's sort of all there, whereas like my mom is no longer alive to be in the film to struggle with.
Right.
And she would have won. I didn't have a chance in the struggle in a certain way. And I think she did win. Like she wasn't going to let me film her. It
Mm.
was all, I had this amazing moment. She was pretty far into her dementia, and we were on a drive, and we were reading that Alice Munro book, Friend of My Youth. And it's this beautiful, beautiful short story. and it's set in Wyoming, and it's sort of about a teacher, and it's sort of exactly the era of my mother's mother. And while I'm reading it out loud, I'm just thinking like, art is so great. This is an amazing piece of fiction. My mom must be loving this. I'm just like, oh, I can't believe we get to sort of communicate across time and space with this amazing. And then I finished reading it, and my mom said, or my mom, and this is my mom with dementia, but and she was much more like severe sometimes with the dementia than she was before. But she said, "Don't you ever, ever dare make anything about me."
Okay.
And I was like, ooh, I knew I felt that, but I guess you really think that. And so my mom was formidable in all these kinds of ways, and that's been a like to imagine myself making things that would not be sort of censored by her took me many, many years. Like it's taken me many, many years to be brave enough to make the work that I'm making now. And I think like because my mom, like the biggest critic, was there. So I really have to give you huge props for your mom is formidable too. And I think that's what it took of these women in order to survive through these periods of history. And they needed these like incredible defense systems, and they had a lot to protect. And so, I have empathy for your mother, and I have empathy for your brother and your father and you. But I applaud you for being courageous enough to face her formidableness while she was alive, while she is alive, and even to make the film that makes her uncomfortable to stand on the stage. It's a big deal to have this film on Netflix and out in the world, and all her friends know about it. It's a huge, huge deal for her as a human, and for you as her daughter to say like, okay, we're doing this. It's a huge deal.
Wow. I'm a little bit speechless, Kirsten. You know what? That's pretty much the most incredible thing to think about. And it's interesting. One final thought I will say that is on that note about the women in that generation. The person that was the most scared of me making this film was my grandmother, who's still alive, my mother's mother.
Wow.
Yeah. And she, it was the scariest thing. She said, "Rachel, why would you ever do this? That business was," and again, conservative, and that business was not something that your mother set up.
Your mother's mother.
That's my mother's mother.
There you go.
Yeah. And so in her mind, she was like,
your mother's generation.
Oh, totally.
Your grandmother's generation.
And the biggest, like, all the critics aside, the person that I was the most panicked about seeing the film was my grandmother. And when she saw it, I remember she called me and said, "Rachel, I saw your movie." And I remember my heart just stopped, like time stopped. And I was like, "Okay, Grandma, what'd you think?" And she goes, "Well, you did a good job, actually." And I remember thinking, oh my God, I felt like maybe she saw my mom for a moment, because she had a lot of shame about what my mom did. And she had a feeling of like, your mom didn't, she said to me, "Your mom didn't set out to be in this business. It's not like this was, this isn't something that anyone would ever do. And, we couldn't ever tell our friends about it." And I'm just like, but Grandma, for her to actually say, she said, "Your parents really did something." So that to me, yet again, the female generation,
Oh my goodness. And in some ways you think about like your film, what you did allowed your grandmother to see her daughter with more kindness than she had been able to. And I just think about that as the gift to your mother too. I mean, this is a process. I think this is ongoing. It's all of these relationships are ongoing in the life of the film and what it brings into everyone's life. It's, it brings many things, and not all of it easy. But I just like, that is so incredibly moving. And one that your grandmother could like see her love for you, like that, like through her fear, like the fear is like 2 generations of like really hardcore, legitimate fear that is internalized, that she's able to see the film and see you and actually, And it might have even just been the like, you did good, like, or that was pretty good. Like, it might not feel like much, but that sounds epic, what she said to you.
Oh
Just
my
epic.
God. No, it was like, it changed the entire way that I could imagine like breathing a sigh of relief for a minute. Cause I just felt like, she spent years thinking her own daughter kind of gave up her life for this porn store in her mind, which was, not worthy of her talent and all these things that she had expectations for my mom. So
Yeah.
yeah.
She wanted more for your mom.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
Ah,
this was such an, I mean, we could go on for hours, but Kirsten, I can't thank you enough for being supportive of this film. And I'm such a fan of your work. And, we can go on another time about that as well.
yeah,
So,
well, love fest, but real recognition. It is an epic thing to take on, bringing a personal story out into the world anytime, but when it also involves like generational shame, it's a huge deal. It's a huge deal, and I'm so, proud of you and happy for us as audience of the now and the future that the film exists and that the store gets to continue to live and that all the people who died
yeah.
too young get to live in some way through this. So right on, we're bringing people back to life. We're resurrectors is what we're doing with these.
Yeah. Oh my God. Yeah. No, thank you for saying that. And that's the perfect note to end on, I think. Okay.
It sure is.
All right.
Okay,
Well, thank you, Kirsten.
loving it. Back to you.
Okay.
Okay,
Bye.
bye.